So I've got notes up for this week in the usual place on my blog, dave.if90.net, KIB216, tutorials on week 3. I've put a copy up of the screencast I did of my last lecture. So what we're going over today in the tutorial is very relevant to that lecture. So if you didn't make it to that lecture, it'll be worth rewatching that at some point. And then what we go through today, I think, will make more sense. But in that lecture, I was essentially talking about the dynamic web, and towards the end of it, we got onto PHP, which is the scripting language, the server-side scripting language that enables us to make dynamic websites. So that's what we're going to be looking at today in this tutorial. It's essentially an introduction to the PHP language. So this is a copy of a diagram from that lecture. Is probably the most important one from there, illustrating the difference between the design of a static website and a dynamic website. Okay, and so just some of the things to reiterate from that particular part of the lecture. Okay, all of the difference of the dynamic website happens on the server. As far as the client or the browser is concerned, it doesn't really care what's going on the server as long as it gets HTML back. It doesn't care how it was generated. That's all it cares about, the browser. So in both scenarios, a static website, the dynamic website, what the browser's getting back is plain old HTML. The difference on the server side is on the static website, basically we're requesting individual HTML files, which then get sent back to the browser. Whereas on the dynamic website, we're interacting with a server-side scripting language, in our case PHP, and the generated result of that PHP script then gets turned into HTML, which is sent back to the browser. Now that may combine, or that may generate that HTML in a number of ways. Okay, through the script by itself, but more commonly it will actually interact also with the database to get content and then combine a bunch of HTML with the database content. Some scripting and then execute that script, and then the ultimate response will be generated into HTML. And again, the important thing to know is that by the time it gets back to the browser, it's just plain old HTML again. Okay, so the first thing to know about PHP is that if you're used to creating static websites just using HTML, then you're probably used to just creating the file and then opening it up in a web browser, something like this. So I've got a folder here where I'll just create an HTML file called test. Okay, and then it's sitting there somewhere on my hard drive, and I can open that up with a web browser. Okay, and that will work. Okay, so as soon as we start dealing with PHP, because the PHP requires a web server or a web server running the PHP interpreter to actually execute the code, okay, we can't any longer do that because we need the web server component part of this. We can't just open a PHP file up in the browser. If I do that, so if I change this to a PHP file, and all I have to do that is actually rename the file with a file extension .php. Okay, now that's a PHP file, even though it contains no PHP code. If I try and do that, again, open that with the browser, okay, it's either going to display you the code, which is not very helpful to us, or it's going to offer to download the file for you. Okay, so we have to move away from this idea of locally opening up and testing our sites. So what we need is a web server. Now, whether that's a web server running on my local machine using something like MAMP or WAMP, and there is a post under this week about how to install both those on your machine if you wish to go that route. But for today's examples, I'm going to be using the Qt web server. But you could equally use your, if you've sorted out your hosting already, okay, you could equally use that for any of this. Now, I should just mention a little disclaimer at the beginning. I'm going to probably seem like I'm glossing over a lot of stuff really quickly today. I'm basically going to give you a really broad overview of the PHP language, and I don't want you necessarily to pay so much attention about all the little details of how I'm doing various things. I'd rather that you pay attention to what it is that PHP allows you to do and the methodologies behind it and why we do that. Because when it comes to actually making our WordPress templates, what you'll find is that the amount of PHP that you're actually writing for that is far, far less than even anything I'm going to demonstrate today. So don't worry too much if it seems like you know, I'm not going into a super amount of detail about anything, or if you don't quite understand exactly what's going on. Today's more about giving you an idea of what PHP can do rather than exactly, you know, every little bit of syntax of how you do it. But I'll hopefully give you enough of an overview today, combined with some extra resources that I'll give you to look at throughout the week, so that you can at least have a look at a PHP file and sort of understand what's going on some level. Okay, so back to how to get the PHP file to actually work. So we need a web server, and as I said, I'm going to use the Qt web server for this. I can log on to that using my FTP client here. So I've got the details for my Qt FTP account in FileZilla here, and I can connect, okay, and it connects me to essentially the Qt web server, or my account on the Qt web server, and I see a folder here called public_HTML. Usually, I mean, if you've got your own web hosting and you've logged onto it with FTP and you've seen that, you'll see that there's usually a folder called public HTML, and this is usually the folder where once you go to the domain, that's sort of the root folder or the home folder. So you can store files outside of that public HTML folder that are not necessarily accessible to the web, so you can use it as a place to store files, but anything that you want visible to people on the internet, you usually put in the public HTML folder. So you'll notice that I've already got a bunch of folders in here, and for the Qt web server, okay, the address that I end up having to type in to access this, I'm sure you've all used this before, is webhost.ci.qt.edu.au /tilde my username. Okay, and then this makes me log in with my Qt account. Okay, and then I get a directory listing here. Okay, so what you should notice is that all of these files match, all of these folders, sorry, match what I'm seeing in my FTP client here. Now, when you first set up your hosting, you probably have nothing in here, so you just get an empty directory listing. But I've set up a folder here called KIB216_2014. Okay, and I should delete that file there. Okay, and before I had uploaded anything, okay, this would have been an empty directory. Okay, in order to upload this file, okay, I could do a couple of things. I could upload it using FileZilla here, like this. I can navigate to that directory. Okay, and I could drag this test.php file up there. Okay, upload it like that, go back, refresh the web page. There's my file there, and then I can click on it. Alright, and it opens up like that. Okay, rather than just showing me the code like when I tried to open it up locally. Now, this doesn't actually have any PHP code in it yet. Okay, so it's not doing anything. But the other thing I want to mention first is that a bit of a shortcut way to doing this editing, saving, and then uploading through the FTP client is you'll find that most editors actually allow you to configure FTP accounts in them in some way, okay? And I know Komodo, which is on these computers, allows you to do that. I'm sure if you Google how that's done, you'll find instructions about that. But you'll notice here I've got my FTP account details set up for the QUT web hosting, okay, for this particular project in my editor. So what I've got this set to do is that whenever I actually save a file on this side, that it uploads to the remote host here, okay? So what I can do is I can create a new file here. Okay, I'll call this test2 dot, sorry, make this a PHP file. Move that. Well, let's just delete this and start again. So I'll delete that. So there should be hopefully nothing now on the web server. Okay, so I've got an empty folder structure again. Okay, and I'll create my test file again. Test.php. Okay, I'll make it an empty file, or let's just make an HTML file. Okay, but what I want you to notice is that actually every time I'm saving a file over here, this is a view of my remote web server over here that actually gets included. Okay, because it can get easy to forget while I'm doing these that actually at each step that I'm saving these files, they are actually getting uploaded to the web server. Okay, so that's probably the most common thing to forget to do when you're starting out doing PHP, is that you'll upload it to the server initially, but if you're not using FTP embedded into the editor, if you're saving it and then going out and uploading it each time through FileZilla, or doing the sort of view edit thing from FileZilla and then saving and uploading, okay, then people wonder why their changes aren't coming up. So if something's not working, the very first thing to check is, are your files actually on the web server? Have you remembered to upload them? Okay, so now we refresh that and my file, test.php file, should be back there. Okay, and it's there. It clearly hasn't uploaded since oh, sorry, no, there's actually no content in here, so let's put something in here. Okay, there we go. Alright, so I've saved that, it's uploaded, I've refreshed the page, and there's the content of the page. Alright, so we should actually, this is going to be a PHP file, we should actually put some PHP code in here. So I'm going to close the view of this remote host window here, just to. Yes.
So, last semester, what we found out we could do is you can actually connect to your server through Finder and then
Yes.
work off that file.
Yes.
Is there a downside to working straight onto the server rather than saving and then remotely connecting?
There isn't. So you're talking about, you can go like this, and you can go.
And that wasn't just because we're on QUT computers. We can do that with our own servers, or?
That's the thing. You probably can't. Yeah. So sorry, I was just going to demonstrate that, then I stopped. So we can do a connect to server thing like this at QUT and open up. Okay, I might have the address wrong, but let's try that one. Okay, so it would look something like this. So you would essentially be working off the files directory there on the server. So that's a perfectly fine solution, but unfortunately that only works here because the web server happens to be on the same local network as what you're working here. So yeah, unfortunately, in most cases you probably won't be able to do that. So the easiest way then is actually to integrate the FTP with your whatever editor that you're using, and then it will automatically upload those. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to hide this remote host here just to bring back a bit of screen real estate, but just remember that every time I'm making changes here, they're automatically being uploaded to the server. Okay, so I'll hide that. Zoom in here a little bit. Okay, so I've got an example down here. I've got a bunch of example code throughout that at some point, if you want to go back and test this, you can copy and paste this code. Let's see if I can, there we go, let's get that. So I'll just copy and paste this example. Hang on. Oh, okay, that's useful. Oops, that's not it. There we go. Okay, so this is the first example, and this actually contains some PHP code. So I guess the first thing to know is that anytime we write PHP code, in order to tell the web server or the PHP interpreter which parts of our file are PHP and which parts are something else, usually HTML, okay, we surround our PHP code in these PHP tags. So the opening PHP tag looks like this, okay, angle bracket question mark PHP, and the closing tag looks like this, question mark, and then closing angle bracket. Okay, and then anything we write in between this, whether it's 1 line or 1,000 lines of PHP, okay, that will be interpreted as PHP. So in this example, I've just got a single statement of PHP here, which says echo and then the text string hello world and then a semicolon. Okay, so like a lot of programming languages, actually the new lines don't make a difference. Okay, it's the semicolons that delineate statements of PHP from each other. So I could write another statement like this. Okay, that same statement, I could do it twice, or I could do it all on one line. And in fact, where the tags are, doesn't matter if they're on the same line either. Okay, as long as they're surrounding the PHP. So quite often, when there's a single statement of PHP, you'll see it all written as one single line like this. Okay, so as for what this actually does, this echo is a built-in PHP statement which essentially says whatever comes after the echo, output that into the HTML. Okay, and it will happen wherever in the HTML the code is positioned. Okay, so that's easiest seen if we actually save that. It's uploaded to the web server, and I'll go back and refresh this test page. Okay, and we can see that hello world is output there. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, so we get hello world output there, and I'm going to view that in the browser development tools. And this is the point that I kept reiterating in the lecture, and I'll keep reiterating it over again, is that you'll notice if you inspect the code, okay, as I keep saying, there's no PHP here. The PHP all gets executed on the server, and what gets sent back to the browser is simply the resulting output of that script. So we could have a PHP program here that does a bunch of stuff. Maybe it declares a variable. Okay, and if it's not using any sort of statement to output something into the HTML, then you won't see the resultant output. Okay, so there's a PHP program there that declares a variable, but it never echoes anything out to the HTML output. Okay, so we don't see anything there except a blank line. Okay, and as I said, this appears essentially in the order of elements that we've got in the document. So because we've got it between the body tags, that's why it's appearing between the body element, within the body element in the HTML page. So if we style that inside of a heading, for example, okay, if we wrap that bit of PHP in a heading and refresh this, okay, the content gets output inside of those heading tags. And again, the browser doesn't care about the PHP. All it sees now is a heading tag with hello world inside of it. It goes, okay, I'm going to style that as a heading. Okay, so this image here just re-illustrates that point. Okay, no PHP code sent to the browser, PHP code is executed on the server, and the resulting HTML sent back to the browser and then rendered how it would render a static HTML page. So this is different to a client-side scripting language like JavaScript. When we write JavaScript, okay, then we go like this. Okay, so I want you to notice the difference here now if we look at the code. Okay, the JavaScript here, okay, is actually sent back to the browser. Okay, and that's what makes it a client-side scripting language. This web server, when it comes across JavaScript, doesn't do anything with it, doesn't execute the JavaScript. It simply sends it back to the browser, and the browser is what executes the JavaScript. Okay, and in this case, a line of JavaScript that does essentially what the PHP statement does, which is output something to the web browser. Okay, so that's the big difference between the two. And as I said before in the lecture, the reason that we have client-side and server-side scripting languages is if you've got any sort of sensitive information, all right, you don't want it to be visible. You don't want things like usernames and passwords to be sent to the browser and visible to someone just by looking at the code. Okay, so anything to do with sensitive information is usually handled by a server-side script. Okay, so that's the difference between those two. So now I guess we'll go through again some of the features of the PHP programming language. And some of these I'll demonstrate and others aren't really worthwhile. It's just better if we just kind of look at them. Okay, but the first one is comments in PHP. Okay, so comments, as we know from any other programming languages, are exactly that. They're a way to comment your code. Anytime you have a comment in any programming language, it's ignored by the interpreter. Okay, it's not considered an actual statement. It's just there usually to leave yourself or other people notes about what this bit of PHP or HTML or JavaScript, whatever the language might be, does. Okay, so the way that we write comments in PHP is pretty common to a lot of programming languages. We have two forms of comments, a single line comment which starts with a double // and we have a multi-line comment which is bookended by a / asterisk and then the reverse of that at the end. Okay, and I've put in this example an HTML comment as well to show you the difference between that. So an HTML comment's actually a fairly unusual format of commenting or syntax of commenting. So it's got the angle bracket exclamation mark, 2 dashes to start, and then dash dash angle bracket to end. And that's the only style of commenting that you can do in HTML. So often when you're switching back and forth between HTML, JavaScript, PHP, it's easy to get your comment types mixed up. Okay, so just remember when you're within the PHP tags, you need to use PHP commenting. When you're outside in the HTML, you need to use HTML commenting. And if you had JavaScript, you'd use JavaScript commenting. But fortunately, JavaScript and PHP use the same commenting syntax. Okay, and as it says in the aside here, quite often we use comments to temporarily disable lines of code when we're testing something. So rather than deleting it and rewriting it, we can just comment it out and it becomes inactive. So in PHP, we've got the concept of variables. So variables are just ways that we temporarily store bits of information, simple bits of information that we can reuse again at some point later on in the code. Okay, and this is one of the things where PHP has a bit of a different way of doing things than a lot of other programming languages. You might be used to in JavaScript, for example, creating a variable by using the keyword var. and then doing something like that. Okay, in PHP, I'll just break this up on multiple lines again to make it a bit easier to read. Okay, in PHP, to declare a variable, we don't use the var keyword. Instead, we use the $sign to start the name of the variable. So that's how PHP knows that you're talking about a variable. But other than that, the declaration is the same. Okay, so we create a variable name and then we usually assign it a value. But rather than using the var keyword, we just start the variable names with the $sign. And then anytime we refer to it later on, okay, we have to also use the $sign. Okay, and that's how PHP basically tells variables apart from any other part of the code. So PHP has similar rules for naming variables as other programming languages. Okay, and I've listed those here. So a variable name must begin with a letter or the underscore character, not a number. And a variable name can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores. And a variable name can't contain spaces, okay, because if I do it like this, then PHP doesn't know if I'm talking about a variable called first and then some statement called name, or a variable called first space name. That's the same in any programming language. Variables have to be one whole word. And in PHP, variable names are case sensitive. Okay, so the variables lowercase y and uppercase y represent two different things. Okay, but they're common rules in any programming language for naming of variables. Okay, so here's a code example here of just creating a few different variables of different types. So I've got first name and last name here, which create variables of type string. Okay, string being text, and we've got two variables here which create numerical type variables. Okay, so again, similar to other programming languages, we have the concept of different data types. We've got numerical data types, we've got text strings, we've got booleans as well, which is just a value true or false. Okay, and then we've also got, oops, let's go back. We've also got the concept of operators. So again, this is very common to all programming languages. So PHP allows us to perform calculations using arithmetic operators. Okay, and there's a link here to a W3 Schools article defining those operators. Okay, so it's things like you're used to: plus, minus, multiplication, division, and modulus. This modulus one is the one that gives you the remainder of a division sum, which can be useful in some scenarios. But the big difference in that PHP has with other languages is when it comes to using the operator to concatenate strings. When I say concatenate, I mean join strings together. Okay, so for example, in JavaScript, okay, if we had var first name and last name, and we wanted to join those two things with an empty space, okay, we could say full name equals first name plus a space plus last name, like that. Okay, to write that same thing in PHP, it's essentially the same, okay, but I'll create this other variable here. So again, the variable name would be created with a $sign. Okay, and create full name. Okay, again, it would be first name. But instead of using the plus sign, okay, to concatenate strings in PHP, we use the full stop. Okay, so that's how you'd write the equivalent statement in PHP. Exactly the same, except for the way we refer to the variables, and we use a full stop instead of a plus to concatenate strings. Okay, so that's another, when you're jumping back and forth between languages, that's another common thing that you'll forget. So you'll often write it like this, okay, and that will throw an error because it will assume that you're trying to do a numerical addition calculation between two strings here, which it can't do, so it will throw an error. Okay, so we've got functions in PHP as well. So functions are blocks of code that can be called as many times as we want from elsewhere in a program. Okay, so in this case, this example is let's say I want to output a person's name multiple times. Rather than repeating the code each time, I could write a function and call it as needed. Okay, so in this example, which I will copy the code and replace my entire example here. I don't know why I've got that include config PHP up there. That's not necessary for this example, so just ignore that there. I should fix that code. Okay, but again, I'm just declaring these values, and then here's where I'm defining the function, and then here's where I'm calling the function, and I call the function 3 times, and I pass it parameters each time. Okay, so a function can be passed parameters which it can use inside the function. In this case, I'm passing it the first name and last name variables that I've created here, and all that the function does is echo out, well, first it joins the first name and last name with a space, and then it joins those with opening and closing paragraph tags. Okay, so what this function will do is output the first name and last name with a space in between them inside a paragraph tags, and in this case it will do it 3 times because I've called the function 3 times. So if I save that, make sure it's uploaded to the server, come in and refresh. Okay, there it is. There's the 3 paragraphs that are output. Okay, and sorry, there's another typo in here. It's a closing paragraph tag instead of an opening one. I should fix that in the example as well. That's what it should actually look like. Okay, and then there's my name output inside of paragraph tags. And again, no PHP sent to the browser. It's executed. The HTML is generated on the server, sent to the browser. All the browser cares is that there's 3 paragraphs there with some text inside it, and that's how it renders it on the page. Okay, so that's a function. And I've just got a note here to say that PHP function names have the same naming rules as variables, okay, except that they don't begin with the $sign. Okay, now, like most programming languages, PHP has a bunch of internal or built-in functions that you can call to do various different common things. Okay, and you can extend these with other PHP files as well. Okay, but there's a bunch of built-in functions which you can find all documented at this address here, php.net/docs.php. Okay, it looks like they've updated their site a little bit, but it's essentially the same. You'd search for, you can either browse or search for functions. Okay, so in this case, okay, so this bit of code here, which I'll copy, and let's remove that. So I've just got my variable name still declared. And in this case, you will notice I've got essentially 2 separate PHP scripts here. I don't have to do this, I could do this all as one, but let's just say I had a heading here. Okay, so you don't have to write all of your PHP in one part of the HTML file. You can split it up as long as the different bits of PHP code are themselves contained within the PHP tags, then you can write it anywhere you want. Okay, and so things like variables declared in this bit of PHP are going to be available to ones declared in this bit of PHP as well, or referenced in this bit of PHP. So what this line of PHP does is, again, it's using the echo statement, so it's outputting something into the HTML. It's outputting, again, the first name, space, last name, and then apostrophe S, BMI is, and then it's doing, sorry, this needs more to this example, actually. Sorry, I deleted too much. Or I didn't, oh, sorry, I didn't look at this extra example. So, I should look at this example first, sorry. Yeah, this example here is another function which, I use this example a lot. I'm sure I used this last semester in the JavaScript example. Takes a height and a weight and it calculates a BMI. It does a mathematical calculation, weight divided by the square of the height. Okay, I remember why I had this example now. So the difference between this function and the previous function was the previous function outputs something on the screen. This one returns a value. It doesn't output anything, it returns a value which can then be used later on. So here we go here. So this is me creating a variable called BMI. And when we assign a value, which is a function call, to a variable, okay, it will be assigned whatever is returned by this function. So we call calculate BMI, send it the height and weight, and so this will ultimately be assigned a number, which is the calculation weight divided by height times height. Okay, but the important part of this example is down here. No, it isn't. It's the inclusion of this example here. Okay, which I won't add yet. We'll see what it does without it. But so first of all, this is designed to echo out the first name and the last name and what the BMI is. Okay, so I've saved that. It's uploaded to the server. Refresh this page. Okay, and it says Dave Wallace's BMI is 22.152646 and a bunch of other decimal points. Okay, so I don't need that level of accuracy. It actually affects the legibility, I think, if there's too many decimal points there. So what I really want to do is round this number. So this is where we demonstrate a built-in function in PHP. Okay, so I'm going to change this line to essentially be exactly the same, alright, but I'm going to add the built-in function round here. Okay, so this round function, I can look up what that does on the documentation. Okay, and it tells me it rounds a float. Okay, a float is just another name for a decimal point number. Okay, so, and there's usually examples of what happens here. Alright, so now the documentation can seem a bit cryptic in how to read it here, but this is essentially telling me I pass it the number that I want to round, and then in these square brackets here, these are optional parameters. Okay, so one optional parameter is precision, which defaults to 0, and it explains all the parameters here. So precision represents the optional number of decimal digits to round to. Okay, so in my case, I'm telling it to round this value of BMI to 1 decimal place. Okay, and then the result of that will be output here within the echo statement. So I save that, make sure it's uploaded to the server. Refresh, okay, and there's my number now rounded to 1 decimal place. If I change this parameter here to 2, okay, it's rounded now to 2 decimal places. Okay, so the built-in functions are designed to do things that are commonly required. Okay, so you can imagine rounding a number is something that's commonly required. So rather than having new code, I mean, you could write that function yourself to round a floating point number to decimal places, but rather than having to do that every time you create a new project, they build it into the language so that it's available there for you, so you have to do less work. So the whole concept, I mean, that's a good point to make, the whole concept of programming is that in the end, it creates less work for us. Okay, it might seem like more work up front, but the whole idea is to reduce the amount of work required. Okay, and this is another good point to state here, that when we do get around to making WordPress templates, actually most of the PHP that you will write will be calling WordPress functions. Okay, so when you install WordPress, if you look through the WordPress PHP files, what you'll find is it's mostly a whole bunch of functions. Okay, and pretty much what you're doing when you create a template is writing the HTML structure and then simply calling WordPress functions which do things like go and get the content of this post from the database and output it here. Okay, so that's what I mean by the PHP that you'll end up having to write is actually less complex than most of what we're going to go over today. All you're really going to be doing, or most of what you're going to be doing, is just calling the built-in WordPress functions. Okay, so moving on, we also have the concept of conditional statements. Okay, so conditional statements, again, these are very similar to other programming languages. They simply allow us to test a condition, and if that condition is true, do one thing. If it's false, do another thing, or if it's equal to a different value, do another thing again. Okay, so this example here, which I'll copy and paste into the editor. This example here is designed to output a different welcome message depending on the time of day. Okay, so first of all what it does is declare a variable called current hour and set that to this result of this function call here, date, with the parameter capital H. Okay, and if I go and look at, so that's another PHP built-in function. Okay, and basically what you do is call date, and then you send it a string which describes the format that you want to get that date back in. Okay, so for example, if we want to get the day of the month, we give it a lowercase d. If we want it to get the year, for example, okay, if we want it to get a four-digit version of the year, we give it a capital Y. A two-digit version of the year will be lowercase y. Okay, and then all of these things for hours, minutes, seconds. Okay, so this date will give you back anything from a year to a second, and probably even milliseconds. Okay, depending on the string parameter that you pass it. So in my case, I'm passing it a capital H. Okay, which gives me, it says 24-hour format of an hour with leading zeros. Okay, so 00 through to 23. Okay, so basically it's going to give me a number from 0 to 23 representing the current hour of the day. And with that number, I can then create an if statement like this, where I can say if that current hour is less than 12. Okay, so if it's less than midday, then I'll echo good morning. Okay, else if the current hour is less than 18, okay, 1800 hours is 6 p.m., then echo good afternoon. Otherwise, we can assume that it's greater than 18, in which case echo good evening. Okay, so we should be able to see that now. Okay, so I'll save that and make sure it's uploaded to the server. Refresh this, okay, and it's outputting good morning. Okay, so it'll be interesting to come back after 12 p.m. and test that again and check that it actually does output good afternoon. Now, the important thing to notice about that date is if I was running this off a local server, okay, it would use my machine's time, so I could change my time here and then test that. The fact that it's running off the Qt web server, it's using whatever time is set on that computer. Okay, so it's important to note that the date, especially when you start dealing things with time zones, which you can set, okay, all of the dates are going to be based off the server on which it's running, not the client's computer. Okay, so that's if statements, conditional statements. We also have the concept of arrays, which is actually something that you probably will deal with a fair bit in WordPress templates, because things like so an array is essentially a list of items, and a lot of the things you're going to be doing in WordPress templates is retrieving lists of things. So lists of menu items, lists of posts, for example. Okay, so they'll be returned as an array. So as long as you know how to access items in an array and loop over arrays, then that's quite easy then to output. I mean, it doesn't matter what's in the array. It could be simple values, or it could be, in case of WordPress, whole entire posts. Okay, accessing the information and outputting it happens the same way. So arrays have slightly different ways of declaring an array in PHP from other programming languages. So again, so let's I'll copy this example again and paste that. Let's put it there. Okay, so this example creates an array, a variable called fruits, which is an array which contains 1, 2, 3, 4 strings, okay, which represent different names of different fruits. Now, to create that same array in JavaScript would look something like this. Okay. Like this. Okay, and then accessing it would be something like this. Okay, so actually accessing the array items looks the same in PHP and JavaScript, but declaring the array looks slightly different. Now you may see PHP examples where it is actually done like this as well. But it's only more recent versions of PHP that allow you to declare an array like this. So the safest option is to do it like this. Essentially what you're doing here is calling a built-in function called array, passing it a bunch of parameters, and it's returning you an array object with those parameters in it. Okay, so that's how we declare an array in PHP. In terms of accessing the elements of the array, okay, it's the same as in JavaScript. All right, we put the name of the array variable, and then in square brackets we put the index of the array. Okay, and now as I say here, it's important to remember that, like a lot of other programming languages, the array indexing in PHP starts from 0, not 1. Okay, so the 0th index of fruits array is apple. Okay, which means the index 2 is 0, 1, 2 pear, not 1, 2 orange. Okay, so if I run this example in the browser, okay, there it is, outputting pear. Okay, so that's another common thing to overlook. All right, is to remember that the array indexing starts at 0, not 1. Okay, so and as in a number of other languages, we can index our arrays either with a number, or we can index our arrays with a string, which is called an associative array. Okay, so this first form is, or the default form of an array is a numerically indexed array, but we can also do a associative array, which looks like this. Oops. Okay, and again, the big difference here is in declaring the actual array. Okay, so again in JavaScript, to do an associative array would look something like this. okay, and so on. So the difference in PHP is essentially rather than using, so what we've got here is a bunch of key value pairs separated by commas here. Okay, so the commas still delineate the array items, but we have to specify in an associative array what we're calling the index, or what's going to be the index for each of these. Okay, so in JavaScript we'd separate the index and the value using the colon. In PHP we separate the array index and the value using this here, an equal sign, and then the angle bracket. Okay, but then again, accessing the actual value is going to be the same. Okay, so, or whatever the value happens to be. So in this case, we're accessing in the person array whatever value has the index last name, okay, which is this one. So that should output then this value here. So I'll load that example up, okay, and there it is outputting the last name value. So what we could do is, what's often useful for debugging arrays is to output, use this function called print_r, and what that does is prints out an object essentially, and an array is a type of object, so we can print this out, and I'll show you what it looks like. So if you want to see what is actually contained within an array that you have, because you might get this array back from a call to a database or an API or something, you might not want to know what's in it. Use print r and then pass it the array value, okay, and if we wrap this inside of pre-formatted HTML block like this, makes it a bit easy to read, okay, then this gives me the representation of my array. Okay, so there I can see my 4 array items, okay, with the indexes and the values on the right hand side. Okay, so that's arrays, and as I said, you probably will use those in your WordPress templating. And in each of these sections I've got links to more detailed information about each of these concepts as well. We've got loop constructs. Let's check how we go with time. No, we're going to write. Okay, we've got loop constructs. So loops allow us to execute a block of code a given number of times. So for example, the for loop is used to execute a block of code for a predefined number of times, and it looks like this. So I'll copy this example. Okay, so the for loop looks like it does in JavaScript. Okay, we use the keyword for, and then inside of these brackets we essentially have 3 statements here. Okay, we have the condition that needs to be met for this loop to continue going in the middle, and then the first part is where we declare essentially a counting variable. Okay, so this one's creating a variable called I and setting it equal to 1. And then the last part is modifying that variable. So in this case, ++ is a shortcut way of going I equals I plus 1. Okay, it's called the increment operator, just means add 1 to that number. And it says keep doing whatever in the loop while I is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so first time through the loop, I equals 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then 5, and then when I equals 6, this condition fails to be true because 6 is not less than or equal to 5, and so the loop stops and continues on with whatever is passed here. Okay, so if we run that in the browser, oops. Okay, there we go. So it's outputting the number is and then the value of I. So number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and I've just got should be like that. Okay, I'll line break items so that they don't all output on the same line. Okay, so that's a for loop. Probably what's going to be more useful for you in WordPress is the for each loop. And the for each loop essentially loops over the values in an array. Okay, and we don't need to even know how many values there are in the array. And it looks something like this. Okay, so again, we need an array to loop over the elements. But in WordPress, this will probably be something like an array of posts that gets returned. But the important part is this bit here. Okay, so this loop, okay, is called a for each loop, and we use the statement for each. And here, instead of declaring counter values, we basically say this first thing here is for each. This is the value of this is the name of the array that we want to loop over, and then we use this keyword as, and then value here is a name of a variable that we assign the value of each array item to each pass through the loop. Okay, so that sounds convoluted to say, but essentially what it's saying is, in the first one, assign this item value to that, and then the second time through the loop assign it to that, and then the third time through the loop assign it to that, and then the fourth time through the loop assign it to that. Okay, and then it will reach the end of the array, and then it will stop the loop execution. Okay, so what we should see is this outputting each of these values, okay, with then a line break. Okay, so refresh that, and there it is. Okay, so it outputs each of the values in my array with a line break. Now I can modify this slightly to also, if I need to output the, as well as the values, the keys or the array indexes, I can. Okay, so I can do this like this. Okay, and then I can echo out the key as well, and then I can say equals plus, or I'll use the same syntax that it uses with this little arrow looking thing here. Okay, so if I do that, right, I can access the both the array keys and the array values. Okay, if I ever need to do that. And I could do this with a numeric array as well, if I wanted. There's nothing to stop me from doing that. Okay, so I could, for example, do this. Okay, and instead of looping over person, I can loop over fruits. Okay, and you can see that the array index now is numbers, okay, because it's a numerical array, or a numerically indexed array. Okay, so that's looping. Okay, that's the example what I just showed you there. Okay, now this is a bit of an aside, but I only bring it up because you'll probably see this in WordPress templating. There's actually a couple of different ways to define where the start and the end of the loop begins. So so this example, I should copy this example. I should demonstrate this example first because it's actually slightly different to how I've written it. Oops. No, I don't want that. That's what I want. Okay, so this is the same as what I did that previous example, except that instead of just outputting it with line breaks, I'm actually outputting it within a table. Okay, so this will output the key value pairs, but rendered in an HTML table. Okay, like that. So this example, okay, I can rewrite this. I can rewrite this for loop a different way. Okay, and that's demonstrated by this one here. Okay, so you can see this ends up getting a little bit messy in this example because I'm echoing out, you know, bits of HTML inside of PHP strings. And it would be nice if I could keep the HTML a little bit separate from the PHP. And I can do that by, in PHP, writing the for loop a slightly different way. And the different way looks like this. Okay, so essentially what I've done here is I've split up the bits of PHP and the bits of HTML. Okay, and that allows me to write the HTML still as part of the HTML, and it still looks like part of the HTML rather than inside of PHP strings, and then echo out the appropriate parts of this loop inside of here. Okay, but the big difference to note is essentially this part here and this part here, so the start and the end of the loop. I could still write this like this, okay, so we're used to defining the start and end of the loop with these curly braces. Okay, but the problem with this is when you start to have a lot of PHP and HTML interspersed, it's hard to figure out, or can be difficult to figure out, which opening curly brace this end curly brace belongs to. Okay, so that's why they give you this alternate way of writing the start and the end of the loop. So we can change this opening bracket to be a colon, and we change the closing bracket to be basically end plus whatever the loop type is. So if it was a for loop, we'd say end for. Okay, in this case it's a for each loop, so we'd say end for each. Okay, so you will probably see in WordPress templates this format of loop syntax written more than using the curly braces. Okay, so that's all of the PHP syntax that I want to go over. I've got a link here with more information. So obviously the W3 Schools link, I linked to a bunch of these individual things, but the whole PHP section is or can be useful. And then I've linked to a good Linda course on PHP as well, if you want to look into that more. But definitely I'd suggest looking through at least these extra links on each of these sections that I've put throughout here. One other thing I should mention that I skipped over a bit is in terms of when I used the PHP built-in functions, I just sort of knew off the top of my head what it was. But obviously when you're starting out, you're not going to know all the functions that are available there. So probably the best way of finding out how to do things is actually just to Google the answer, and it will usually direct you to either Stack Overflow or, in fact, the actual PHP documentation. So in this case, I just Googled how to round a number to one decimal place in PHP. Okay, and the first link is the link to the PHP documentation. Okay, and then the second link is a Stack Overflow questioning asking exactly that. Okay, and they give you the exact code to do exactly that. Okay, so that's you'll probably spend a lot of time Googling how to do things when you're starting out learning anything, as I'm sure you're aware with learning anything else. But there are heaps of online resources for learning PHP and also figuring out specific examples of how to do certain things. And the same will be true when it comes to WordPress as well. It's one of the reasons we choose WordPress is because it's very popular and there's lots of examples of how to do things online. Okay, so that's PHP. By all means, throughout the next week, look into the language itself in more depth. But probably the more important thing I want to demonstrate today is the example of transitioning from a static website to a dynamic website. Okay, and that's what this example is all about here. So there are example files here if you want to attempt this yourself at some point or follow along. What I would suggest is the static HTML exercise that you did last week. I'd recommend at some point after today, throughout the next week, attempting to do the same process that I'm going to demonstrate here, and turn that into a more dynamic site. Okay, but I'll demonstrate the process here. So again, another little disclaimer here: don't be alarmed at what might seem like quite complex code here. I've got, for example, some code which interacts with a database. I've only got that here so that this example works without having to do something like installing WordPress. But when it comes to WordPress, it's very unlikely that you'll have to interact with the database directly. As I said, there'll be WordPress functions that do all that stuff for you. So, don't be alarmed at what might seem like complex code in this example. Question?
How is the second assignment actually integrated with WordPress exactly? Like, I'm just a little bit confused about that.
So the second assignment is you creating a WordPress theme for your portfolio.
Right, okay, but we're uploading it to our own domain?
Yes, that's right.
So what does WordPress actually offer us? Like, why are we using WordPress instead of just using PHP and making it better?
Because if we used PHP by itself, you'd have to write a hell of a lot more PHP, know how to do a lot more complex PHP, and it would take you more than an entire semester to write your own CMS using PHP.
So the WordPress essentially just gives us like a template to start from?
Yeah, it makes the whole process easier. So WordPress essentially is a whole bunch of built-in functions that will do stuff, handle stuff like setting up the database. So, I assume you've used WordPress before, right? Like the interface at all? Well, some people have. It's essentially, if you look at it, there's two sides to the interface. There's a front end, which is all your posts, okay, and then there's a back end where you can enter posts, right? And so they're essentially the interfaces for making that whole thing simpler. So rather than you coding in all of that PHP code to allow people to create the content, that's already sort of there for you, and all you have to do is do the theming part or the templating part, which is there's all the content that's going to be in the website. How am I going to lay that out in a page? So you're essentially designing the look of your site, but then learning enough PHP to use the WordPress functions to grab the content and output it into the page, if that makes sense. So I'll elaborate on that much more when we actually come around to doing WordPress, and it will make sense. But today, I guess, today the two goals are getting enough of an introduction into PHP so that when it comes to seeing the PHP in the WordPress template, it doesn't seem completely foreign. And this exercise is sort of about demonstrating why the way that WordPress does what it does is useful without having to go through the whole thing of installing WordPress first. So I'm trying to do a sort of stepping stone thing rather than going straight from a static website to WordPress. Yeah. Okay. So I've got this static website. I'm just going to delete this test.php file there, and I've got this static site folder here, and I'm going to upload that to my web hosting. Okay, and let's just go back here and see if that's there. Okay, so there's my static site folder. I click on that. Inside there's an index.html file. Okay, so it loads. Okay, and this is what it looks like. Okay, so it's very similar to what I got you to do last week as the static HTML exercise. Okay, so it's 2 pages, and it's got a header, navigation, content, sidebar, and a footer. Okay, and in terms of the files that it has, whoops, I accidentally moved it off my local drive there. Put that back there. Okay. Okay, so in terms of the files, let me just hide this again. I've got an index.html file, a about.html file. I've got some CSS files, okay, I've used normalize, and then my own CSS file, and a couple of images for the background and the logo. Okay, so what I want to do is, so this, I guess this exercise is all about convincing you. So a lot of people don't remain convinced that going to this little bit of extra effort to create a dynamic site is worth it. Hopefully with this exercise I'll convince you that it is. So what I want to do is demonstrate adding content to this site as a static site and then changing it to a dynamic site and showing you how adding content to it becomes easier. Okay, so we've got our index.html page here, and I've got my about.html page here, and let's just take one very small simple example of adding another page to this site. Okay, so let's say I want to add a third page to this site. I'll create a new HTML file. Okay, I'll call it page3.html. Okay, and given that my template sort of stays the same, okay, there's not much difference between the home page and the about page other than this content area here. Okay, then as long as it remains pretty much the same, then the easiest way of duplicating this is probably going to be to copy one of the existing pages and paste that, and then modify what's different about this. Okay, so the things that I need to change are the heading, obviously. Okay, so home, I'll change that to page 3. And then the content, I'm going to need to change here. Alright, then let's add some dummy content in here, some paragraphs. Okay, and alright, so make sure that's up on my server, page 3, and I should at least be able to navigate to this now. Okay, so there's my page 3, but I'm not finished yet because I need to add a link to it on my menu bar here. Okay, so, and I need to add that link to every single page. Okay, so I need to go back to my index.html and add a link item here to page3.html. And same deal with the about page, so copy that, paste that, save, paste, save. Okay, now refresh that. Okay, so there's my page 3. Okay, it hasn't come up on the About Me page yet. Ah, thank you, I did too. There we go. Okay, so that wasn't too hard. Alright, I added an extra page. Now let's say I want to go and change, let's say I want to change the site title. Okay, so I don't want it to be my static site. Let's say I want to make it Dave's static site. Okay, so I can do that. I've got to go in and change it both in the title here, okay, because I've set it up here, as well as the heading here. And I've got to do that in 2 places on 3 different pages. Okay, there we go. Alright, and again, okay, it hasn't taken me that long, but you can extrapolate this process out to if I had 10 pages or 100 pages or every other little change that I wanted to make. Let's say I want to change the logo to point to a different file, and I have to go through every one of these files and update the link, okay, the link to that file, every other change. So it makes sense that, I mean, it sort of doesn't make sense why we need to keep repeating the same process over and over again. So in all of these files, the code's pretty much identical except for a few different things. Okay, so aside from the content here, nothing changes in most of it except for the menu items here and then the content of this section here. Everything else remains the same over every page. So we can use the power of dynamic web technologies to actually make this process better. Okay, and in this small example, it might not necessarily save that much time, but again, if you extrapolate this process to more changes, more updates, more pages, more content, then it becomes ultimately a massive, massive time saver for us. Okay, so I mean, you can think of this site. Just imagine that this is your portfolio, okay, and you've done it as a static website, okay. And a couple of years down the track, you've probably got a bunch of blog posts. You've got a whole bunch of pages for each project that you've worked on. And then you've probably got some menu pages or the overviews of them. Okay, imagine coming through that and then having to make a single change to the menu then, and making sure everything all connects up properly without breaking. So the way we're going to make this a better process is by making it into a dynamic website. Okay, and there's sort of dynamic and there's dynamic. Okay, you can do this sort of part way, and you can do this the full way, and I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. But to start off with this, what I am going to do is actually start off with my static website. So a lot of the time, what you will do is you'll design sort of the templates, or the template, if your site has one template, of your page as a static page, because it's easier to design, it's easier to get the design working as a static page. So what I would normally do is I would have just started with one page, maybe the home page, got that working as a static page, and then gotten rid of, or not bothered with these other 2 pages. Okay, but just started with the index. So what I'm going to do is copy that over to my dynamic site folder. And I'm going to copy my CSS and my images folder over, because I'm going to keep those as well. Okay, and I'll close all these. And the first thing I'm going to do is turn my index.html file into a PHP file by simply renaming the file extension to .php. Okay, and then I'm going to upload this whole folder to my web server. Okay, and that's done. Okay, they're all here. I can see them. So now when I go to the dynamic site, okay, it should still look like the static HTML page, okay, because there's still HTML in there, alright, but these links won't work, okay, because I haven't copied over the about me and the page 3 HTML files. Okay, so that's what I want to start off with. Just my index.php file and my CSS and imagery sources. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up into a bunch of separate files. Okay, so I did mention in the lecture that we can do that with PHP. We can split up a bunch of different files and then include them back into the main file. So the way I'm going to split this up is basically by looking at the page and thinking over multiple pages which of these things is going to stay the same. How can I split this up into modular items? Okay, and so the first thing I'm going to do is say, well, across all of my pages I'm going to want essentially this same header and a navigation. So I'll make that one component. Then I'll make my content section one component, because that will change. Then I'll make my sidebar section one component, and then I'll make my footer section one component. Okay, so I'll start off by trying to figure out where the header section actually ends. So in my case, I want to pull out everything down to the bottom of the navigation and put that in its own component file. So there's the bottom of my nav element there. I'm going to select everything from the top down to there. And I'm going to cut that and put it into a new file which I will call header.php. Okay. And again, make sure that that header PHP is now uploaded to my website, and I've got to make sure it's in the right folder here, dynamic site. Okay, that's better. Now, if I refresh the index page here, okay, you'll notice that, well, what happens is what we should expect, okay? I've cut out the header which contains the link to the CSS file and everything, so all I'm getting is essentially the content that's left in there. If I look at, header.php, alright, I get the header including the links to the CSS and so forth. Okay, so that's what's in the header.php. Okay, now I'll do the... Well, actually, before we go and split it off into lots of different parts, let's just see how I end up going and recombining this back in. Now, I can recombine this back in by using a bit of PHP. Okay, and I can use a couple of different PHP statements to do this. I can use include, and then the path to that file, so header.php. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. And what that basically says is go and look for a file called header.php, grab everything that's in that, and then essentially cut and paste it where this PHP statement is. So it's essentially doing the reverse of what I just did. It's going and getting that code and then putting it in here. Okay, so now if I go back to the index page. Whoop. Thank you. There we go. Alright, we go back to the index page. Okay, we can see obviously that it's re-included that file back in there. Okay, and it might just seem that I've done something redundant. I did something and then programmatically undid it, but you'll see why it becomes useful in a moment. Okay, so I'll do the same thing with other parts of my page. So I'll separate the footer off here into footer.php, and I'll replace that with now, just to keep this consistent with my example, I said that there are a couple of ways you could do this include. So there's also a statement called require that does essentially the exact same thing. The only difference between include and require is that if we use include and it can't find this file, it will stop executing. Sorry, that's the opposite. If we use require and it can't find this file, then it will stop executing and you'll see no output. If we use include, then it will just ignore that and keep outputting everything else. Okay, so practically it doesn't really matter that much for this example which we use, but I'm going to use require just to keep it consistent with the example files that I have on there already. You also might see either include once or require once, and this just means sometimes we'll want to import or include a file in different places, but we only really need to do it once. And so if we say require once, basically that's saying if I haven't already included this file, go and include it. Okay, but in terms of templating, we may want to include the same file multiple times. We might have two sidebars, for example. Okay, so we can just use require. But again, functionally, it doesn't matter that much. The important thing to know here is what this is doing. It's going and finding that file and basically cutting and pasting whatever's in that file into this file here. Okay, so for the footer, I'll do the same thing. Require footer.php, and for the sidebar, split that off, and include that exactly where it was. So require sidebar.php, and I think we'll leave the content section as it is, I think, for now. Let me just look at my completed example to make sure I'm on the right track. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay, so sidebar index. Okay, so let's make sure that all still looks correct when we load this up now. Okay, so there it is, and again, the browser can't really tell that that's being dynamically put together on the server. All it gets back is HTML. Okay, but so this is the first step of making this site dynamic. In that now, if we want to add more pages, okay, so let's say we go and add the about.php page. Okay, and I'll duplicate this to, where are we here, about there. And all I need to do is change the about content section . Okay, now because I don't have any of that navigation menu stuff in here, I don't have to edit that menu in multiple places. Okay, because the header is being included in both index.php and about.php, in order to modify the header, or the navigation, I now only have to modify it in one place. Okay, so assuming I only had the one link and then I add another one, this obviously is now going to be index.php. The about now. Okay, only needs to be modified in one place. Okay, so there it is. And again, let's say I want to go and change the site title again. Now, rather than having to do it in every single file, okay, I can come up here and let's say, well, it's a dynamic site now, so let's change it today as dynamic site. Like this. Okay, and again, that's reflected on every page that includes that header file, and I've only had to modify it in the one place. Now I can make this even a little bit more dynamic, because here I've got the site title being output in multiple places. Okay, and I could have it in multiple more places. So what I can do is create a PHP variable called site title. Okay, and now if I want to change the name of the name again, rather than changing it in multiple places, okay, I can just replace this with a PHP statement which echoes out the site title wherever I want that to happen. Okay, and now when I want to change the site title on any page, all I have to do is come and modify this variable here. Okay, so that's gotten too big for me, so I want to revert back to the old title. Okay, but all I have to do is come back here, modify this variable, and anywhere where that's output now, okay, is going to be reflected. Okay, so that's another step of making it even a bit more dynamic. Okay, but really the real power of making this dynamic would be if we actually didn't have to bother about making an extra file for each of these pages. If we could in fact just have one template file where we store the content separately, and like what WordPress will do for us, we inject it into the template. So what I've got for that is I'm just going to copy it across from my complete example, so I don't have to retype out this code again. Okay, but I've got this file called database.php. Okay, and I've got this SQL file here. Okay, and so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to no longer store the... Actually, I'm going to completely get rid of this about.php page. Okay, I'm going to delete that. And what I'm going to do is actually store the page content and also the menu items in a database. Okay, and this database.php file, and again, this is a code that you totally don't have to worry about what it's doing here, because you won't need to do this with WordPress. WordPress will take care of this for you. But this file here will interact with the database. So I can look at the databases that I've got set up here by actually going to a site called PHP my admin. What is it? Sorry, I might have to look this up. Well, let's see if I can remember. Okay, lucky guess. Okay, so this is PHP my admin, which is a web interface for administering databases, essentially. And your web hosting probably has this interface somewhere, which you can probably find through the cPanel. Okay, but this is the Qt one, okay, and so these are all databases that I've had set up before, and I've got one here called KIB216. Oh, they're all prefixed with my username, but this one's KIB216 underscore intro to PHP. Okay, and inside of here I have a table, one single table called pages. Okay, so a database, just very quickly, you can imagine a database essentially like a bunch of spreadsheets. Okay, they're just tables with rows and columns. And that's essentially all they are. Okay, and there's a language called SQL, structured query language, that we use for interacting with the databases. Again, you don't need to learn SQL because WordPress takes care of all of that for you. Okay, but essentially that's what this file here is doing. Okay, these things here are SQL statements. This part here is just connecting to the database. Okay, this here is an export of the database so that I can import the data to that database, but it's already here, so I won't be bothered doing that again. Okay, the only thing that I really want you to pay attention to here is that this table has 2 rows, okay, each row represents a page that's going to be in this website, okay, and it has 3 columns, okay. There's a title, which contains the title of the page, which I'm going to use for the navigation menu, and it has the content of that page, okay, which I've simply just copied and pasted from those static page examples. And then finally there's an ID column here which contains a unique numerical ID for each of these entries. Okay, so it's common, you'll see that in any database, is that it will have some ID that identifies the rows. Okay, because it is possible that I could have 2 pages that have the same title, for example. Okay, there might be 2 different drafts of the same page, for example. Okay, so we'll have a separate column called ID for identifying a specific row. That's all you need to know about the database. Okay, this here is simply just information about connecting to it. Okay, again, there's a host. In this case, it's database.ci.qut.edu.au, a username, a password for that database, okay, and then the database name. There's a bit of PHP here which creates a connection to the database. There's an if statement here which basically checks whether it connected successfully, and if it didn't, it outputs an error message. Okay, but assuming that it does, it creates a essentially all of this is just creating a connection to that database. Okay, but the important part of this file is actually these functions here, okay, which is what I'm going to be calling from my other files. So there's a function called getPages, which does a query. So when I say query, it means go and ask the database for this information, okay, which is basically telling it to return all of the rows from pages, and getPosts tells it to return, ignore that one because there actually is no post in the table. This one here is the other one that I'll use, getPage, based on ID. So this will get me the content of a single page row, okay, based on the ID that I send it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first of all go to my header.php file here, okay, and because we're running a little bit short on time, I might just copy some of the code rather than typing it out from scratch. So I'll go back to my header here, and this is what I want here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is essentially replace the contents of my navigation list here. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of those hard-coded values, and I'm going to replace it with a bit of PHP code here. Okay, so the PHP code here is first requiring that database.php file. Okay, and then it's creating a variable which will be assigned the value of getPages. Okay, and getPages is that function in my database file which returns, okay, this information from the pages table of my database. Okay, and that information will actually get returned as a associative array. Okay, so that's why I'm then using a for each loop to loop over the pages object. So when I say it gets returned as an associative array, okay, you could define each of these database rows as an array. Okay, a list of items indexed by, okay, the column title. So that's exactly what I'm expecting to get here. Okay, so then I can pull out the ID of that row by referencing the ID index of that page array, and then the title by referencing the title index. Okay, and again, if this seems a bit complicated, don't worry, WordPress takes care of this for you. But essentially all you need to know that is that I'm getting each of those page results from the database, and then this is the important part here where I'm echoing out a list item with a anchor tag where the href I'm setting to index.php page equals ID, and then the name of it is outputting the title inside of that link. Okay, so I should be able to see what that does by going back to my site here. Okay, and there it is output there. It might not necessarily look any different to how it did before. Okay, but you can see that it's outputting the link in this different way here. Okay, and the reason I'm doing that relates to what I'm going to do next, which is modifying the index.php file to output the content now from the database. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. Make sure I keep the closing article tag. So now this is what my index.php file looks like. Okay, I'm going to replace the content now with a bit of PHP. So as I said in the lecture, you end up having sites that look mostly like PHP. There's not a lot of content in there at all. So what I'm going to replace this with is this bit of code here, which I will paste and then explain what it does. Okay, so let's ignore this first part, okay, and look first at this part down here. Okay, so ultimately the content that it's outputting, okay, again it's going to use that database function to get the page information from the database, but in this case I'm calling a page with a specific page ID. Okay, so if it's the home page, the ID is going to be 1. If it's the about page, it's going to be ID equals 2. Okay, and so once I've got that page, again, that's going to be returned as an associative array. Okay, I can output the title of the page by using page brackets title. Okay, and I'm outputting that inside of a heading 2, just like I had the heading output in the static example. And then I'm going to echo out the page content in the same way. Now this top bit here is all about getting the particular page ID. Okay, and we use that using something that I touched on briefly in the lecture called get parameters. Okay, so I talked about how if you look at a lot of websites, okay, a lot of static websites, if, for example, Google, okay, if I do a web search, let's say I search for Brisbane, okay, the way that that bit of information gets to Google servers so it knows what to search for is actually sent along in the URL. Okay, so there's the domain name part of the URL, okay, and then at the end there's something tacked on to the end that we call the query string. Okay, and that contains a number of key value pairs that contain information that can then be accessed by the server script. Okay, and in this case, one of these says Q equals Brisbane. Okay, and that Q will be shortcut for query. Okay, but that's the search term. These other things, who knows what they do. Okay, but there'll be something related to what Google needs in order to perform that search. So we can do exactly the same thing. Okay, we can, in our website, okay, go to index.php and then add a question mark, okay, and then do something like page, so what am I looking for here? Yep, okay, page equals, and then we can tell it the ID of the page that we want. If it's the home page, we say page equals 1. Okay, and if it's the about page that we want, we'll say page equals 2. Okay, so this bit of code is actually accessing that bit of information out of the URL in order to get that value there for page. Okay, so anything that we put in here is going to be accessible to the PHP script inside of this special array called $_ and then in all capitals GET. Okay, so the reason I have this in an if statement, okay, I could not have that in an if statement, and I could just say page ID equals $_ get page, like that. Okay, and I need to also make sure that that's uploaded. Okay, so hopefully this works. Okay. Alright, let me just check. Okay, so we can at least see that this much is working here. Okay, so I've printed out the page ID that we've gotten here. Okay, which is number 2, and if I change that to 1, okay, it outputs there. Now, what I really want to do is, so I'll change this to require once. Okay, so we need to make sure that this page is working. Okay, and now I'm printing out the content of the page. That's the page information that's been returned from the database there, and it appears to be working now, so I don't really need that. So let's try refreshing that again. Okay, so now you can see, even though, okay, this content now is not existing in the index.php file, okay, it's getting output, it's just being accessed from the database. Okay, and if I change this number 1 to number 2, okay, you'll notice that it outputs the information that's in the database for the About page. Okay, so we're really getting somewhere now. Now, the reason that I had this as an if statement up here initially, I'll show you why. Because undoubtedly people are going to come to my website, okay, and they're just going to want to type in the address without having to add index.php equals question mark page equals 1. Okay, they're just going to want to come to the site like this. Okay, and if they do that at the moment, okay, then that page ID is not, that page parameter here is not existing. Okay, so it's not put inside of here. So the reason I had the if statement before, the reason I had the if statement here, which I'll now put back in, okay, is basically saying, so this is set function checks if a variable actually exists. Okay, so this is saying if that get page parameter actually exists, then set the page ID to whatever that get parameter for page is. Otherwise, if it doesn't exist, okay, then set the page ID to 1, okay, which defaults to the home page. Alright, so in my database, the home page, the ID is 1. So if we have it like that, now if they just come to my root URL, okay, and that get parameter is not set, then it will default them to the home page. Okay, and because of the way, if I go back here in the header, I set up this here, okay, you'll notice the index.php question mark page equals, and then the ID of each of these pages. Okay, that's why these links now work, okay, because they're sending it to the URL with that page ID parameter set to equal whatever it should equal for that menu item. Okay, so that's how we make the website dynamic. So yes, admittedly that took some extra work, but now look how simple it is to add an extra page of content to this site. All I have to do is go into my database, okay, and insert a new row. Okay, give it an ID, this one will be 3, a title, page 3, okay, and some content. And insert that. Yes. Alright, accidentally inserted that twice. Let me just delete one of those. Okay, so now my database has 3 entries in it. Okay, page 3. Now I'm not going to touch the code at all. Okay, and as long as I've not messed this up, I should be able to refresh the site. Okay, and not only has the menu updated, okay, but that content's automatically output there. Okay, so you can see now when you again extrapolate that up to a bigger website with more changes, okay, how useful this can become in the long run. And that's essentially what WordPress is going to be doing for us, okay, except that WordPress is going to take care of a lot of the internal workings so that we don't have to do things like write our own database code. Okay, so what WordPress will look like is actually very similar to what we've done here. You'll be splitting parts of the template off into different files, re-including them, and then actually using WordPress built-in functions to do very similar things to what I've already done here with the database, but not having to write your own database code. Okay, so that's probably a good place to stop. When I said I'd recommend that you try doing this process with your last week's example, don't worry about doing the database stuff, but I would practice doing the thing that we did where we split these off into different files and then re-including them back in using the require statement. So that's what I would suggest practicing with going from the static example to that. So if you're comfortable with that, that puts us in a really good place then to start looking at WordPress, which I think we'll actually be doing in 2 weeks' time, because we've been looking a lot at technical stuff so far, but obviously your first assignment's mostly to do with the design. So next week Cassie's lecture and their tutorials are going to center around design stuff. Okay, and then the following week we're going to start actually looking at WordPress. Okay, are there any questions before we finish up? No? Okay, alright, well thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.